All right, welcome everyone to another session of our Sunoikesis Herodotus course. And tonight we're going to talk about Book 9, which is the final book of Herodotus, of Herodotus's account of the Persian conflict with the Greeks. So coming to a close here. So we're also thinking about some big picture ideas as well as what's in Book 9. Going to turn it over to Professor DeSmidt from Carthage College, and he's going to give us a little background. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Is my audio okay? I hope so. Great. Yep. It's exciting to be here at this moment, as Gwen said, on the verge of Book 9, which I think, as I said when I had a comment session to speak a little bit more to you, how exciting a class like this is when it's so luxurious to be able to spend so much time reading such a great work of literature. Book 9, for me, is really interesting because of the way Herodotus caps the work as a whole. And so I think in some ways Book 9 gets short shrift when Herodotus is studied, because there's a great deal of emphasis put on the ethnographic sections. What does he say about the Egyptians or the other peoples? And there's sometimes less emphasis put on the actual history, the events that are being talked about. And what is wonderful about Book 9, it's really a terrific blend for me of real history and also a lot of very important thematic and literary techniques that we see on display that I think in some ways are quite unique, or at least show why Herodotus is such an incredible author. So in terms of the history of Book 9, one of the most significant things is that we sort of have a bit of a mirroring here. We have in Book 9 what is almost exclusively Greek successes in history. And so the centerpieces are, of course, the Battle of Plataea and the Battle of Mycale. And that is kind of mirrored by the previous battles at Thermopylae and Artemisium, where the Greeks did not have success. And so over the course of Book 9, we see the Persians progressively pushed away, right, repelled and pushed back out of Greece, out of Europe, and back into Asia Minor. So in terms of the actual history that we see, the two focal points there are those battles that I mentioned, are Plataea and the Battle of Mycale. And so what's interesting there, of course, is that we see a very, very different Greek army. When we think back to Thermopylae and Artemisium, we really had this picture of millions and millions of Persians attacking, very, very few Greeks. Obviously, Thermopylae, is a terrific example of that. And so many people say, well, Herodotus, I mean, could he have even thought his numbers were accurate and, and whatnot? But in Book 9, we see things become much more level, even though the numbers are significantly different. Things really change for the Greeks. And so we have not only the battle numbers and the odds, in a sense, of a Greek victory increasing, right, which of course is very important, but we also see continuing on this sort of stronger sense of, of kind of nationalism, on the Greek side. The other thing that's important about Book 9 is that in it, there's a lot of foreshadowing that goes on. One thing that's really important, and I think Green in particular as the editor and translator does a good job of this, is having us, or signaling to us, that we have to remember that Herodotus lived a significant amount of time after the history that he was writing. And so he lived into the time of the Peloponnesian Wars, when this sense of unity that's being emphasized and underscored, particularly in the later parts of the history, became really civil war between the group of people that we see unified here. So the Athenians and the Spartans fighting against each other instead of unified. And so for those of you that are interested in ancient history, and particularly Greek ancient history, and are going to move on to read Thucydides and study that not only does Thucydides criticize and challenge Herodotus as a historian, but it's really interesting to see how those themes of unity and the structural and literary techniques Herodotus uses to emphasize those ideas are actually also challenged by Thucydides. So it'd be wonderful if we had another semester here to go on and do with Thucydides what we've done with Herodotus. I'm already reached the end of my time, but two things that I wanted to mention before going on are the ending events of Book 9, which I think are very, very important. And going back to what I said at the beginning about Herodotus, really doing something unique here, are extremely significant, and they sometimes get underlooked. So at the very end, Herodotus introduces to us the story of Protesilaus. And at the very end of the history, we also are returned in this kind of example of ring composition all the way back to Book 1 and Cyrus. And so I wouldn't say a lot, but a number of historians, modern historians, have actually thought that the histories, Herodotus's history, might not be complete for that reason. You may have noticed in the footnotes, there are a few moments when Herodotus says, well, I'm going to talk about this later. I'm going to return to this at a later point and tell you about it. And there are actually 3 occasions in the history where he says that and never does it. And that, in combination with the peculiar way Book 9 ends, has signaled to some people, some critics, that maybe something isn't going on here. What I really like about that is that I know a little bit later tonight we're going to talk about Herodotus in relation to Homer, and a lot of people say the same thing about the Odyssey, right? For instance, that the ending of the Odyssey probably isn't the way the author or the tradition actually intended it to end. So it's sort of interesting. It's always kind of nice that that's a battle too, and then another battle. But and I realize I'm taking up more time, but the important thing about Protesilaus, does anyone know where he fits in, what his mythological story is, or what his claim to fame is? Probably not enough time to wait for someone to respond in the chat room, but if you remember, he was the first person that went off of a ship onto land in the Trojan War. And he was there was an oracle, which is what fits really well with Herodotus. There's an oracle that says, well, the first person to do that is going to die, right, is going to be killed. And so Protesilaus had this great honor. He was the first person to, in a sense, do this. But on the other hand, it led to his destruction. I also really like the idea that it involves a ship, right? And so much of Herodotus' history is about that. Also involves the land battle. But it's fun to talk about, who is Herodotus really wanting us to parallel or see as parallel to this figure Protesilaus and that myth, seeing that there's an oracle that this is going to happen, but doing it anyway, right? And reaching that. And the interesting thing about that, Protesilaus he's honored. He achieves heroic status. He's worshipped pretty much as a god. You know, Greek hero cults is an interesting phenomenon, but right, that is kind of the tail end of book 9, is what happens when we learn the Persians have taken sacred sort of items out of his shrine at the Chersonese, right, at the Thracian Chersonese, so in the city of Elaos, right, where is also happens to be the place where the last spot where the Persians are getting repelled, right, out of Europe, out of Greece, into Asia Minor. So it's an incredibly interesting story. And so it kind of, in one way, I think works as a lens for us to understand Xerxes, but it's bigger than that because, remember, book 9 ends with Cyrus. Cyrus saying that, you know, basically the story is, if you do something like we see the Persians trying to do in the history, you're going to become a different kind of people. You're not going to be what you were. And there are, I guess, in a sense, psychological ramifications to, we might say, to war, but also to this idea of conquest, intense kind of desire. And remember, book 9 begins with Mardonius wanting, burning with a desire to conquer Athens again, right, and do this. So what's fun about these episodes at the end of book 9 is that they work as lenses for many of the characters. Individually at the moment, Xerxes, but we're brought back to Cyrus, and then we're brought again because of the theme of kind of hubris or overstepping boundaries, to the entire project that the Persians are undertaking here, right? Trying to battle and control really the entire world. Is that, you know, acceptable in all those different realms, the realms of the gods, you know, political and everything else. So great book, you know, a lot of fun. And my vote is Herodotus meant it this way, but you know, others may disagree, but that's a fun thing to discuss too. So thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Oh, sorry, that's me. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Ben. And then we'll move on to your team leaders. And don't worry too much about time. We can go long. I think, Eileen, you were going to go first.
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Eileen. I'm one of the grad students at the University of Findlay in the Rhetoric and Writing program. And I'm here to congratulate you all on finishing this giant text. Well, maybe you haven't finished yet, but you're about to. You reached the end. By next week, you'll finish this huge text, Herodotus' Histories, and not many people can say that, because we found this article called Who Read Herodotus' Histories by Stuart Flory, and the whole time he just kind of talks about how many scholars today give a lot of credit to Herodotus and talk about how popular he was during his time. And he's kind of disproving that because he talks about 3 reasons. One, the histories are huge. He said they are the longest single work written until the 4th century. They're twice as long as either Homeric poem. It would be, a strip of papyrus would be 100 meters long, which is about 330 feet. And it would take over 50 hours to read altogether. And he says the Athenians had a short attention span, just judging by the short length of the other popular texts besides Homer's. He was an anomaly. And few people were literate. The only literate people were the elite, like playwrights, basically, or, you know, people who were voters and just knew how to sign their name. And literature wasn't really valued except for to memorize in order to perform publicly later on. It wasn't like a pastime like it is now. So no one no one probably would have read this really long history. And the second reason, well, okay, the second reason was the literate. Not many people were very literate. And the third feature he kind of talks about in this article is that a lot of people attribute the allusions that are made to Herodotus in other plays, like Aeschylus and Euripides. And he's saying that's not really valid because, okay, maybe they read Herodotus, but that doesn't mean their audiences read Herodotus. Or maybe they heard of Herodotus and then used him as a character or something. Anyways, what he says is not a lot of people read these histories, and you guys have now read this really long text, so congratulations on doing that. I'm kind of speeding through this, not to take too much time. One interesting quote that he had in this article was, "All one can say in conclusion is that enough of the alleged allusions are sufficiently convincing to allow the strong possibility, approaching certainty, that Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, at least, had at various times read Herodotus." So we only really know that they they read Herodotus. And then two questions maybe to think about in the chat room are, why do you think he made the history so long? He knew it wouldn't reach a wide audience, probably. So what was his reason? Maybe he really wanted to insert all of those digressions that he loves so much, or he wanted to separate himself from the other writers of his time. Maybe he was just writing for himself to understand everything and he didn't really intend it for an audience. And then another question is, what happened since then to make his book so popular? Because a lot of people are talking about it recently or since then. And so what changes have happened in society since then to cause his histories to be so popular? And that's my part. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bobby. Take it away.
Can you hear me? All right. So, can you turn that down? Okay. All right. I'm going to talk to you about women, because what's more exciting than a man explaining a bunch of stuff about women? So I want to talk about how women played 9 and beyond. We've kind of talked about this a little bit throughout. How women played pivotal roles in these books, even though they aren't like featured as like these huge names that like, there's no like women equivalent of Xerxes, right? But there's like were made, including women. For example, Queen Artemisia, who is a female tyrant, is actually featured in book 8, and she counseled Xerxes to go home and leave Mardonius in control, noting that if Mardonius succeeds in Xerxes' name, the credit, but if he failed, then Xerxes could just blame Mardonius. She's clever, and she gets away with speaking to Xerxes as an equal, and also in getting him out of her hair by making these suggestions tyrant to tyrant, kind of. Artemisia is reflective, I think, of a lot of the other women in the histories, that she has a small but pivotal role. So another example of that might be, sorry, I'm trying to make sure I read these names. Queen Thamyris, who warns Cyrus against attacking her country and like says, come on, you don't need to do this, you should be content with what you have. And Cyrus, being the tough guy that he is, doesn't like this and decides to fight her anyways and dies. So again, we kind of have this sage wisdom that women kind of have this ability to, through the course of history, but kind of predict the future, or in like men, when they undermine the women, tend to fail. And so that, again, in book 9, when Xerxes falls in love with his brother's wife and fails in wooing her, and then gets married, and then eventually becomes smitten with Artainti. Sorry if I'm not saying that right. But was afraid to ever act on it until he gives her a cloak that his wife has woven, and his wife obviously sees the cloak and then kills Xerxes' true love, Maestes. So we see these kind of like, in this case, kind of almost like soap opera-y stuff happening, that when you cross women or don't follow the advice that women give, that bad things happen. And when women's advice is followed, we generally see positive outcomes. So Herodotus is framing history in a way where women are kind of extremely powerful without maybe making them the center point of the books in any way. Of course, maybe because there's not as much known about them because it was a really long time ago and women probably weren't valued in the same way. But it also might be interesting to think about how Herodotus was making these kind of subtle nods to the fact that while it may not seem like it, women were playing pivotal roles in a lot of the decisions that were being made at the top. So I am turning it over to Megan now.
Mute me. Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm Megan. I'm going to talk about another theme that we pulled out of these books, and it's the fact that for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking primarily about kings and nations and generals and big players that have been changing the course of history in Herodotus's history. But one of the things that our group found really interesting was the fact that there was a surprising number of minor characters or characters of lower birth that end up having a great influence and end up changing the course of history in a big way. So Bobby just finished talking about how women, although they have a very minor role in a lot of the different chapters, they have this big pivotal role. So I'm not going to go over them. They're definitely one of those big players. But a couple of the other people that we pulled out that maybe don't have a large, but end up influencing it in a great way are the characters of the oracle, slaves, characters of lower economic stature, birth, things like that. And then also just characters, we could call them visions or dreams. I think minor characters that end up influencing people in a big way. So when we talk about specifically the oracle, obviously I think we can argue whether or not that's considered a minor character. We kind of argued it group before we started talking about it in general too. But the oracle is mostly talked about, not necessarily having a big presence herself in it. Obviously, there's many oracles, but the oracle's discussed in almost every chapter, and obviously every time it has a big influence on what the characters decide to do, whether they correctly interpret what they meant or not. So, for example, all the way back in book 1, Herodotus reports that the priestess said that Croesus should attack the Persians and a mighty empire would fall. And so Croesus happily launches his attack, but didn't realize that it meant his empire. So even though they can interpret these oracles incorrectly, it still has a huge influence on what they do. And, you know, there's plenty of other examples that I pulled out here. There's one in book 7 with the oracle at Delphi or Delphi. The context is the invasion of the Persians, and the Athenians want to know whether they should stand and fight or flee. And so she says it's going to be catastrophic unless you trust your wooden walls. And then there's that big debate about whether wooden walls meant literal walls that surround the city or whether it means ships or whatever. And it causes this big debate. But either way, the words of this one character are having this huge impact. And we see that in book 9 too, with people trying to figure out what their tactics are going to be for continuing or ending the war. As I said, Bobby gave us a nice presentation on women having that sort of role, so I won't go into that. But another things, I even pulled out dreams and visions, so they're usually taking the form of people. Again, we can argue whether this is a character or not, but there's always dreams coming to people. To book 1, there's a dream coming to Cyrus where he interpreted that Darius is planning a coup against the reign. Book 2, we have a dream persuading Sabacos to end his reign in Egypt. And then one of the big ones is in book 7 when the dream comes to Xerxes on multiple nights and disturbed him enough to say, quote, "If therefore it is God who sends it to me and it is at his absolute will and pleasure that an army should go against Hellas, this same dream will fly to thee also, laying upon thee a charge such as it has laid upon me." So obviously this is having a huge influence on what he's trying to do, and it has a lot of discussion and interpretations before they decide how to amend their plans. The last one is there's a big instance of slaves having a lot of influence on people's actions. In book 9, which if you've read it yet or not, you'll see Sicanes, if I don't destroy that name, was a slave of Themistocles, and he's known for his actions as a negotiator between Themistocles and Xerxes, and he deceived Xerxes into sending his fleet into Themistocles' trap, and so they had this big, that he entrusted him to have this negotiation between these two giant players, and it's with his actions that he convinced it to even occur. And of course, as we talked about, and during book 3, Darius was accepted as king due to the actions of his groom or his servant, who made the horse neigh when it's accompanied by lightning, as Herodotus says, which means that he was accepted by Zeus as the new king. So we see all of these minor characters having this great influence, despite the fact that the histories are mostly written about these big players. So, all right, that was my thing, so I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
All right, can everybody hear me? So I guess it's really hard to talk about any of these last couple of books without actually talking about the battles that take place in them. So I decided to focus specifically on the Battle of Palatea, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and talk about 2 of the things that I really pulled out of that. The first one was that the battle is a very early example of what we would interpret today as psychological warfare, because due to a prophecy that both sides got or received and interpreted from the oracle, as we were just talking about, they both believed that they would win if they were on defense, if they were not the first army to attack. So the psychological warfare comes in because they are trying to get or bait the other army, the Greeks or the Persians, into attacking first, and therefore fating them to lose, according to this oracle's prophecy. So that ended up leading to more than a week of both armies standing on the battlefield, really taunting one another, fake charging with their cavalry, and doing all sorts of little things to try to instigate the ultimate battle, leading to the victory and or defeat of their enemy. And it's just interesting also to look at the fact that both armies are acting on the same information and interpreted the same oracle in that way. And then also really looking at the more minute parts of the battle rather than looking at the generals, just looking at the precision and planning that goes into this. As was noted very early in this lecture, there are tens of thousands to the low hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are gathered to fight on both sides, and it's pretty evenly matched. There's a lot that goes into this because obviously the tens of thousands and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers don't know each other very well, haven't worked together, and have different levels of training and even city-states that they've come from. So there's a lot of bickering before and during the battle about who needs to be where, who's going to fight together, who gets the honor of fighting on the left, the defensive wing, and really what ultimately needs to happen in order to ensure a victory. And while Herodotus doesn't talk a whole lot about the Persian side, that can also be attributed to the fact that the Greeks ultimately won, and history, as we know, is largely written by the victors. So some of those position changes, again, centered around who gets to be on what side and what has the greatest honor. And then when Mardonius is getting worried, he sees the Greek army growing, his own supplies are starting to run out, he decides that he needs to commit to battle. It's also really interesting, my own digression here, the way that Mardonius gets his army to agree to battle, even knowing that the prophecy states if they attack, they will lose, because he chooses another prophecy and then selectively chooses the wording of that prophecy to state that they can win. That action being that he pulls out a prophecy stating that if they attack and then sack the Temple of Delphi, then they will all soon die. His logic then being, if we attack but don't plunder the Temple of Delphi, then we're all going to be okay, and we will win this battle. So that's a brief instance of very selective word choice in order to get people to do what they want, makings of an early politician. Then when they do decide to attack because of this logic, the King Alexander of Macedonia comes over to the Greeks and tells them what the plan is. So the Greeks are a little bit panicked and decide to rearrange their formation again, looking at the minutiae of how this massive battle comes to take place. And they decide to switch sides. They do that at dawn, and then the Mardonius's men react and also switch sides. And so they waste an entire day basically switching sides so that they are more guaranteed to win. They're more likely to have the best soldiers against the weakest soldiers. Thinking about it, just take a step back in terms of the size of these armies. You have tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of men running back and forth across the battlefield to be on the right or the left before they even fight each other. Just moment of, I guess, ironic contemplation there, looking at how ridiculous this would have looked on a grand scale. And then stepping back again to remember the Greeks ultimately won this, because even though I would say most of us don't believe in oracles today, when the Persians attacked, the Greeks were the ultimate victors in that battle. And that's all I have.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone who participated tonight, and I hope you all watching at home. We're excited to see some of your team leaders on camera here today, because they have been guiding you through this semester, and you finally got to see them face to face, right? Lots of great topics tonight. Plenty of things to talk about. I think on Tuesday, we are going to talk a lot about content. So either about what's happening in Book 9 with the battles, with the sort of closing themes, or we can be looking at some of these broader pictures of women and the little people helping to affect the outcome of the historical events. So lots to talk about. And then I think we're going to meet again next Thursday, and maybe we can talk a little more broadly about the experience of this class, if you're interested. So we will meet again Tuesday, be talking to your teams, and have a good weekend. Good night. Thank you again, everyone.